Good evening. I'm Katie Lee Coven, the Executive Director and Chief Curator for the Nora Eccles Harrison Museum of Art. And we want to start by welcoming Darren Perry, who is the chairman of the Northwestern Band of the Shoshone Nation. He is an author and storyteller. He serves on the board of directors for the American West Heritage Center, Utah State Museum Board, American Indian Services Board, and serves on the advisory board for the Huntsman Cancer Institute. And it is important to him that students hear and understand Native American history from the voice of the American Indian. Darren wants to make sure that the story of the Bear River Massacre and the outcomes of that horrific event are always remembered. And it's important that the Shoshone perspective is heard and respected. I'm going to turn some time over to him as we honor the people and the land that came before us here in Cache Valley.
What a pleasure it is to be here tonight. Thank you for having me, Kim. Kim's a dear friend, so I want to just start by acknowledging that we, here at Utah State University, we sit on the indigenous homeland of the Northwestern Band of the Shoshone Nation, a tribe that I'm lucky enough to be the chairman of. I'd like to offer a prayer, a blessing tonight before we begin, if you don't mind. I'll do it in Shoshone and then translate into English. Tmapa. Ona shihikene shikita yata. Yanakata shi mapa. Ona iha. Ona hawani yanashakita. Ono ya no kirtaya. Tamapa. Washakante. O Great Spirit, whose voice we hear in the winds, whose light gives life to all the world, hear us. We come before you as your humble children. We are weak. Make us strong. Bless us that we can find lessons hidden in every leaf and rock. Bless us to treat those who we come in contact with daily with respect and love, especially those who have been marginalized by our society. Great Spirit, help us speak medicine words to those around us. Medicine words are uplifting, they're inspiring, they're words of encouragement and words of love. Help us to live that way so when we come to you, that we may come to you with clean hands and straight eyes. In the name of our Savior, Jesus Christ, amen.
Thank you, Darren. President Cockett was going to give some welcome remarks, but in light of COVID-19, she is in meetings and unable to attend this evening, and sends her condolences for not being able to be here. She really wanted to attend and join us. So this event was organized in conjunction with the exhibition that's currently on view at the museum, Sky Above, Earth Below, A History of Western Landscape Photography, a phenomenal exhibition that was curated by Bolton Colburn, our curator of collections and exhibitions, and is sourced entirely from our collection. The exhibition offers a different vantage point for understanding the history of landscape photography in America and aligns with the Nora Eccles Harrison Museum of Art's interest in expanding and diversifying our understanding of art in the American West, especially modern and contemporary art, or art of the last 100 years. As an academic museum, we strive to be experimental and encourage innovative forms of learning across disciplines with the hope of making a lasting impact. And we provide various forms of learning that are frequently interdisciplinary to expand our perspectives while spurring critical thinking and dialogue. And one of the ways that we do that is through collaboration. So I want to thank the partners here at Utah State University, the Department of Art and Design, the King College of the Arts, the Inclusion Center, the Center for Intersectional Gender Studies and Research, and the Department of Psychology for all making this event possible tonight. I also want to thank our members, our advisory board, my staff, in particular Philip Brown, who has really shepherded this event. And I want to thank the leadership here at Utah State University under President Noel Cockett and Vice President and Provost Frank Gailey for the support that they have given to the museum. I'm now going to introduce our special guest this evening, Kimberly Anderson. She's going to give a 30-minute talk, and then we'll move into a moderated discussion that will be moderated by Professor Deb Jenson. Kimberly Anderson is a transgender woman embarking on the second half of her life, reinventing nearly every aspect of who she is. She was raised in an Orthodox Mormon home, living as a boy in a horse farm here in Cache Valley. Anderson has both a Bachelor of Arts and Master of Fine Arts from Utah State University, and for 25 years, she has been practicing documentary and fine art photography and has been a university lecturer for 10 years in Utah. She has worked all over the world with an emphasis in Asia and Scandinavia. She was married for 20 years to a woman, and together they raised 2 children. Currently, Anderson has just finished graduating from the University of San Francisco with a master's in counseling psychology, and she has been practicing as a marriage and family therapist in San Francisco and Sacramento areas with concentrations on Native American populations, adolescents, eating disorders, and trauma. And her particular specialty is working with LGBTQ youth and their families transitioning through various journeys of faith and spirituality. Anderson is a photographer and author of the Mama Dragon Story Project, an ethnographic study which features portraits and autobiographical essays from over 135 Mormon mothers who have decided their love for their LGBTQ child is greater than their religious dogma. And Anderson has pursued a new spiritual path based on truth, science, and love. Please help me welcome Kimberly Anderson.
So first of all, thank you to Darren. I have salt from Great Salt Lake that I gathered. This is my medicine that I give to individuals. So I will give this to you as my gift of personal medicine to you after the event is over. This was used as currency by the Goshute Indians in the West Desert of Utah for eons. And it has become my personal medicine, and I hope what is not an act of appropriation, but an act of respect and admiration for the Goshute and for the tribes of the Great Basin who used salt in so many important ways. I also brought some pets from Westminster College. This morning I spoke with Jamie Butler. She is one of the directors of the Great Salt Lake Institute, and she sent me with some brine shrimp today. So you can see that my remarks will be centered around Great Salt Lake and salt and brine shrimp. Thank you to all those who are here. Thank you to all those who aren't here for keeping us safe. But specifically those of you who did come, because this is a big deal for me. Thank you to of course, all the people listed, the USU Inclusion Center, the Center for Intersectional Gender Studies and Research. By the way, neither of those two things existed here at Utah State when I was a bachelor or a master's student. So that's a shift in Cache Valley. Thank you, Cache Valley. The USU Department of Psychology, I would love to meet some of those people. And the USU Department of Art and Design, which is my second home away from home. And as I drove up this morning from Sandy, I'm looking at the Great Salt Lake, all the sites that I know like the back of my hand, literally. And I look at the Wasatch and the Ben Lomond Range, and I come up through Sardine, and I see Manaway Lake and coming through across the Little Bear River and see all these sites that I know. This is like my home. This is like putting on my best fitting pair of old Birkenstocks that will never, fail me. I love Cache Valley, and I love the people here. I actually, before the evening began, I went up and down every single row, and I saw the laws. I saw my parents have seats here. Numerous people that have affected my life and touched me are represented in the seats on plaques, as well as those of you who came in person today. So I want to thank you for being here, and for those people that helped build this facility. My daughter's here attending Utah State currently. And if you can close your ears just for a second, I want to address her, even though I'm not sure she's here or not. Abigail, I love you very much. And I appreciate the strong boundaries that you set. And your process of reconciling our relationship. And I'm grateful for your friendship and for the time we've spent together. And I look forward to the time that we can rejoin and start a relationship anew. Thank you for closing your eyes. This journey that I've been on, as you may have surmised, comes at a great deal of cost. One of the ways that I'm able to be vulnerable and authentic in my current version, we are all new versions of ourselves every minute, right? This current version of me has nothing left to lose, and nothing can be taken away from me. So I show up in spaces everywhere I go as just this really super vulnerable and open person. So tonight, I want to, as we get through the evening into the Q&A portion, I want to invite you to be vulnerable in return and ask questions that you may or may not feel comfortable asking to queer or transgender people, because this is what my job is now, is to educate and to share. That's a long introduction. Shut up, Kimberly. So, MFA from here. My father taught here for 20 years in the animal science department. My mother taught here in the music department for 15, 20 years. I was raised in this building and in that building and in that building. So Utah State is very dear to my heart. My MA is from University of San Francisco with a marriage and family therapy emphasis and a counseling psychology degree. So at this point, I'm really overeducated in 2 fine art degrees, or 2 art degrees, and I can't draw. So there's some irony there. I want to talk a little bit about this first body of work. Excuse me. When I was asked by the BYU Museum of Fine Art to create a portfolio of Great Salt Lake images. They saw an exhibit of mine that was hanging there, and the director came to me, Diana Turnbow, and she asked if she could help curate a selection of images that the museum could buy as a portfolio. I'd never done this before, this process, and the Great Salt Lake work started in my MFA program in the early 2000s, and the portfolio was being asked to be created in my transitional period of becoming from Michael Slade to Kimberly Anderson. I wrestled for about 3 years how I'm going to publish this portfolio. Do I use my old name, my dead name, as transgender people call that? Or do I make a clean break with that person and just publish it under Kimberly's name? And I asked a lot of curatorial professionals, and nobody had an answer for me. And so I ultimately had to decide for myself to do it under both names, honoring my former self, Michael Slade. And this is a very surreal moment for me. I'd never use my dead name, ever. And most transgender people never do. So please be aware of that when you know a transgender person's former name or their dead name. Please don't use it. I'm using mine in an act of integration of my former self and my current self. This is not the case for all transgender people. Many transgender people's dead name is very traumatizing to them. So just a bit of psychoeducation. So this is the portfolio, the Great Salt Lake Photographic Survey. This is portfolio number 1. I'm currently on number 2. I think I have about 7 in me before I'm dead. As one can, experience Great Salt Lake in a positive way or a not so enjoyable way, I started working on Great Salt Lake in 1987 when I was an intern at the Twilla Transcript Bulletin. And on the weekends, I had time off, and I would take my mountain bike and drive my Volkswagen Jetta up the dirt roads and go fart around on Stansbury Island and start to understand what this thing is that the Great Salt Lake, was right next door to me. And it quickly became a source of fascination for me. So this is a photograph of a camera in place while I'm making this portfolio of images. The photographs in this series, there are 13 in this portfolio. They are handmade photographs. They are made with a film camera, and the film camera shoots a negative that measures 4 inches tall and 10 inches wide. So this is larger than a 35 millimeter piece of film that older individuals may remember from days gone by, and young children might see in movies from time to time talking about the old people. Anyway, this film camera, 4x10, and then I take some special paper from France that's created specifically for this platinum palladium process. I mix the chemical from scratch, and so now I'm a chemist and an artist, which is weird and necessary when you do this kind of work. And then I brush on the platinum and palladium and I let it dry, and then I lay the negative on top of that and expose it with ultraviolet light, and I make these photographs. Platinum and palladium are noble metals, and they will not fade. So the image will last roughly 1,000 years. The paper will decompose prior to the image fading, because the image will never fade. This is an image that's currently on exhibit now at the museum. This is part of a portfolio that Amy Jorgensen asked me to contribute to called Demarcation. I'm very fortunate to be asked to be part of this portfolio. 20 other Utah photographers who are amazingly, now that I've kind of shifted out of being a photographer or an emphasis of being a photographer, I feel really kind of out of place being invited to be in this collection. So it's strange to feel like I'm an insider-outsider in this dynamic. I walk through the gallery and I see the history of photography in front of my eyes. Ruth Bernard, Mark Klett, Mizrak, Craig Law, a former professor, and then my work is on the wall. So it's an interesting kind of a space to be in as an artist. So this portfolio was really just about kind of photographing the breadth of the stories in the Great Salt Lake. This is the Utah State Marina at Kennecott. This marina has had challenges with the rising and the lowering of the lake levels, and the state has been, it's been necessary for the state to dredge out the channel that exits and enters the marina for sailboats who have a keel that can draft, 8 to 10 feet of water. They have a hard time getting in and out of the marina because the lake levels become so low. In fact, I photographed here the day that they are taking the boats out of the lake with a big crane, excuse me, and these boats are flying through the air and the lake level in the back is receding. Back in the day, when they had the Transcontinental Railroad, you've heard about the Golden Spike. They had the railroad went over the top of the Great Salt Lake, past the Golden Spike, and that was a very slow train transit, a lot of inclines. There needed to be a lot of help from additional engines, and so the Union Pacific Railroad decided to construct a trestle bridge made out of wood from a forest in Northern California. And they sunk 11,000 pilings across the Great Salt Lake and formed a solid trestle bridge across Great Salt Lake, which took 2 to 3 days off of the transcontinental train ride, the commerce and passengers between the East Coast and the West Coast. This bridge was made out of wood, clearly, and the weather on the lake took a toll. The trains are burning coal and sparks are coming off, and there were many fires. The trestle actually caught on fire many, many times. And over the years, Union Pacific Railroad decided that it was too expensive and too laborious to maintain the trestle, and so they built a solid fill causeway just to the north, about 1/4 mile. And that solid fill causeway essentially bisected the Great Salt Lake in half, and it's caused, in essence, 2 separate lakes, the North Arm and the South Arm. The South Arm has a lot more fresh water entering it, so there's a salinity imbalance between the South Arm and the North Arm. There's also an elevation imbalance of about 2 feet. So there's a current, maybe 3 to 4 knots. They've made some breaches in the causeway so that the water can flow, and there's a current from the South Arm to the North Arm because of the imbalance of inflow of fresh water from the North to the South Arm. I'm kind of a nerd, so please bear with me. I never thought I would be a nerd. Actually, I always knew I'd be a nerd. So Saltaire, the resort Saltaire, was created by the Mormon Church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, out on the lake to have a place that was a dry place. Dry, we know what that means in Utah. A place where Mormons could go, active Mormons could go to enjoy the lake. And so in order to get them out there, they formed this trolley company and laid tracks from downtown out to Saltaire. Saltaire has been burned down and rebuilt and burned down in about 3 different cycles. This is a power substation that was left, one of the last freestanding structures from Saltaire, next to one of the last trolley cars from Saltaire. And I photographed this and came back about a month later to re-photograph it with a different camera. And there was a crane, a special excavator digger with like a claw on the end. And after I photographed it the second time, they actually cut up the train car and took it to the landfill, and they tore down the power substation. So this is now a parking lot, concert overflow parking lot for concerts held at Saltaire. Things change. Robert Smithson, our good friend, took some time and built this amazing piece of land art called Spiral Jetty. And as he created this, he knew that the Great Salt Lake levels would rise and fall, and that the lake would alter Spiral Jetty. That was part of his initial plan, his concept. He knew it would change with the lake rising and falling. So I photographed Great Salt Lake, 100,000 times literally, and photographed Spiral Jetty over 100 times, trips out to Spiral Jetty. And as the lake has come and fall and risen in elevation, I take the chance to make different photographs of Spiral Jetty. And I'd never seen a photograph of it with high water looking back at the shore from the very tip of the jetty. So you can see this, the lake levels are very high. The tips of the top of the rock are just barely visible, and I ended up ruining a very expensive carbon fiber tripod because the salt in the salt water does not play well as it dries with carbon fiber. So we learn things about, is that mouse pointer right in the way? Let's move that out of the way. Don't go to sleep, computer. I'm sorry if that mouse in the way ruined everyone's visual experience tonight. So back in the 80s, there was a wet cycle in Utah, and the Great Salt Lake levels rose tremendously. And if you lived anywhere along the east shore of Great Salt Lake, you know that your neighbors in Centerville and Clearfield, and along the lake down into Tooele and Grantsville, the freeways were getting flooded, farms were being flooded, and so Governor Bangerter decided to build these amazingly massive pumps on the west side of the lake. And he put those into production to help lower the lake level and keep the I-80 from flooding and the train from flooding and the airport from flooding. Before the pumps were in place lowering lake levels, pumping the water out onto the West Desert, several of these lake level depth markers were put in place. And you can see, I have a laser pointer. I'm going to use it. This, right? That's right about the highest level of the lake between 84, 85. So that's still there. I'm actually surprised it has lasted that long. I've photographed that specific site several times. Went out there photographing, one of the last times I went out there photographing with a friend of mine, and we were in about a 75 mile an hour storm coming across the lake, and the weather as it crosses the lake is amazingly complex and rich to look and watch at. And Alfred Lamborn, a painter from early Utah history, he lived on Great Salt Lake for a while on Gunnison Island, and he painted and wrote about Great Salt Lake. And he wrote about these storms as they would march in succession across the Great Salt Lake. And I would be out there in these storms reading Alfred Lamborn's words, looking at these marching waves of storms crossing Great Salt Lake. The pilings in the background, the set of 3 pilings, are 2 feet in diameter, maybe. And those waves, by my best estimate, are between 6 and 8 feet tall. It was a rather remarkable afternoon. So because I am such a nerd and I love the Great Salt Lake so much, I decided, hey, let's make another portfolio, a series of images where I use salt from Great Salt Lake in the production of the photographs. And when I was a graduate student here, the second time I was asking Craig Law about this, and he actually kind of dissuaded me a little bit. He said this might be too complex, a little too hard to integrate into a broad body of imagery and tack on a technical challenge of making salted paper prints with salt from the Great Salt Lake. So I put it on hold in that moment because I did need to finish my degree, and I decided I would come back to this idea later. So I created a portfolio of 13 images, and kind of word got out that I'd done this crazy thing of using salt from the specific sites that I photographed. And a friend of mine, let's go back one, Christina Z. Anderson, she's a photography professor at Montana State in Bozeman. And she asked me if I would be willing to supply 6 pages of information for this book. Once she's created this manual of how to do this in various configurations of salted paper printing, she has a second section at the end of contemporary artists. And she asked me if I would contribute photographs for the book. And I was in the middle of my counseling psychology program, and I was too busy. And she kept asking me, she was very patient. And so finally I kind of broke down and wrote some things. And there may be mistakes in the text because at the time I was starting to be a therapist, and salted paper printing wasn't in the front of my mind. So I wrote a bit about my process, and I included some photographs along with the text. Photographing the tugboats, actually, that are still there. These 2 tugboats helped build the railroad trestle from the early 1900s. So they are still in place. Kids from Ogden have come out there and kind of sprayed some graffiti on it. So this is the big camera that I'm using on this project. The negative measures 12 inches tall by 20 inches wide. It's this really massive thing. And I actually brought it to set up for this lecture. And it's clearly not set up because I forgot about it. I drug it all the way from California. The best laid plans, right? So then I talk about the creative practice of why I'm doing this. The salt printing for about 2 years, self-taught, with the help of some amazing friends from the internet, which is true. I am not a chemist. I'm not a scientist. But this project required some chemistry and some science. A little artist statement. Some more process photographs. The color image on the bottom is with the camera in place. The image on the top is a ATK solid rocket booster test for the Orion project, the next generation of solid rocket boosters to send rockets into space to go to Mars. I'd photographed it from the ATK side many times, and I wanted to photograph it from the landowner's perspective. So I knew where it was on the map, and so I triangulated the site where I knew the rocket motor test was, and now my map nerd is starting to show up, and I know exactly where I want to stand to have water that flows into Great Salt Lake between me and the rocket test. This, by the way, is Connor Springs, heading towards the lake. I can only imagine. When I saw this cloud come up over the hill, you guys have seen this from Cache Valley. I know we can see this plume from the valley. When this plume came up over me, I was literally right underneath it. In fact, I can stand closer to this in this site than the spectators can from the official viewing platforms. So in this moment of making this picture, I was the closest I will ever be to this test. It was ominous to see this coming over my head. The only thing that I have to put it in perspective is photographing forest fires and being really just kind of up in the forest and watching this go on. And then a little biography. So everywhere I would go and make pictures with this giant camera, I would sample the salt. And that salt would have brine shrimp flies in it, dead stuffs, twigs, sticks, sand, whatever. So I would take it back to my darkroom and I would filter it and strain it and weigh it and measure it with special tools and a special thing called a salinometer. Oh, geez, I just butchered that. All my salt printing friends are going to slap me. But here I am. I've got a laboratory grade scale. I've got a hygrometer with different scales in there. I've got a bucket of salt collected at Spiral Jetty. So I measure this salt and get it down to a very specific level of salt in the water, and then I paint that salt water on the paper. That's called salting the paper. And then once the paper is salted, then I add silver nitrate to the salt. And the silver nitrate isn't also in a special formula. So once the silver nitrate meets the salt, now that becomes silver chloride. Is that right? Who are my process nerds out there that remember this? Someone's raising their hand. Is that right? Silver nitrate? Yeah. Or silver nitrate and sodium chloride provide or produce silver chloride? Okay, thank you. Who is that? My husband, Mark. Oh, he would know. Yeah, he would know. Thank you, Mark. Nerds unite. Hey, let's go make salt prints together. So now they have this light sensitive emulsion on the paper. And when I expose it to ultraviolet light, now I can make a photograph. This is literally the invention of photography, combining silver nitrate with salt water from England back in 1830-ish. So, yeah, thank you. Oh, get up here. Why are we not co-presenting this? This is good. It's good to have a fact checker in the audience. I phone in a friend. So here's this giant 12 by 20 camera. At that same location I used the other camera at. I photographed the site many times. It's different every single time. So in that moment with that giant camera, I took a left image and a right image. And in one image, I'm shooting into the sun. In the other image, I'm shooting away from the sun. So there's a contrast difference, which has a difference. It requires a difference in developing and processing, and also a difference in the salt solution that I put on the paper. I went back and rephotographed this 3 times, and each sheet of film costs $25. So I'm in this photograph in just costs of film at least $75, not to mention 3 days of my life that are well spent. So more location photographs of the camera and the lake. It's fun to see these after. I haven't looked at this body of work in a while, so it's fun to kind of look back and remember what it was like to be in these places. These are salt sickles left over from foam that sprays on the trestle bridge. Is that in there twice? Maybe it is. So after umpteen years of photographing on Great Salt Lake, I guess he was getting kind of tired of salt and the desert. So I decided, what can I do that feeds my map nerd, my folklore nerd, my story nerd, my special collections nerd, my narrative nerd? What feeds that? And I remember back to growing up as a kid, my dad would take us camping, and he would regale us with stories of Bigfoot around the campfire. And I thought, I wonder if there are any stories of Bigfoot in Utah. And so I did a little Google, and I discovered that, yes, indeed, there are. There's more than 1, and there's more than 10, and there's more than 100. And Special Collections here at Utah State University in their folklore program collects these stories. And so I spent a day, maybe a day and a half, actually, over in Special Collections photocopying every single one of these stories. Not to mention the other stories I would find. And I started a blog, utahbigfoot.blogspot.com. After 2 or 3 years of doing this, you can see I started it in 2009 and I ended it in 2014. Actually, I'm still making photographs on this series. I just haven't presented or processed and printed them. After a few years of doing this, individuals started coming to me with their experiences. Police officers, sheriffs, bishops, trained observers, people with community standing that had things to risk and things to lose, and they would still come forward with these stories. And so I would travel to these locations with this 4x10 camera. Again, I like this wide panoramic view. And I would take the narrative with me of this eyewitness account. This person saw a thing do something that they can't explain, that they attribute to Bigfoot. So I would go to the location, and I would have the narrative with me, and I would read through it, and I'd get a feel for the narration and the feel for the place. And I'd set up the camera and make a photograph. The images on their own are quite mundane. They're just spots that we camp at. This is Blacksmith Fork Canyon. Oh, this is the Bear Lake Hot Springs on the northeast side of Bear Lake. Blacksmith Fork Canyon, left-hand fork of Blacksmith Fork Canyon. I have camped in this site. Each one of these sites or these images has a narrative that's very compelling. And it makes you kind of wonder, what has this person really experienced? And my work in Native American spaces on the Ute Mountain Ute, the Southern Ute tribes, the Navajo, the Hopi, the Native American people have a very healthy space carved out for the unknown. And white people don't have that. We need to explain everything. And I learned from my Native American friends, I was taught that space of not knowing can be very fun, and it can be a healthy space to put these things that you're not quite sure about. So I like to have that space in my life, and that's where this project kind of goes for me. I don't know. I don't care. I like that we don't know if Bigfoot's real or not, because either side of that equation is pretty cool. Logan Canyon, snowplow driver saw this creature look in the cab of his truck at night when he was plowing snow, and the snow plows, 10, 12 feet off the ground. Providence Canyon. as I'm doing this project, one of my very best friends from elementary school, a guy named Jeff Harrison, he and his sister Dawn had a sighting when they were children of Blacksmith Fork Canyon. And when they were confirming the story details to one another, his sister Dawn actually put off doing this for years because she was afraid to relive this experience. These individuals that have had these sighting reports, when they relive it, their hair stands on end, their body goes through a somatic response, their voices quiver, they start to sweat, they get chills. They relive the trauma they experienced when they had the sighting. My background in psychology now tells me that we can't, at will, produce trauma-like symptoms unless there's an original source trauma event. So I don't know what happened to these individuals in the moment of the event, but whatever it was certainly trauma-inducing, and they relive it when they tell it every single time. To me, as a psychologist now, that's compelling. Eden in North Ogden Valley, a mom and her son coincidentally saw a mom Bigfoot and their child go back and forth from the chicken coop on the left to the rock wall on the right several times and then run off up the mountain. They saw this many times. Every single house in this valley has a similar story. Now, either they're really good at influencing each other, or something's really happening over decades and decades. North of Aspen Grove, on the Alpine Loop, some BYU kids in a Volkswagen Bug, out catting around in the winter, saw one standing in the middle of the road, and it wouldn't move, and they had to swerve to go around it, and keep from hitting it. This is a few years ago. So that's Utah Bigfoot. And that took me away from Great Salt Lake. Actually, it was kind of a parallel process. The last body of work I want to talk about is the body of work that turned me into a therapist. As I was transitioning, I was really kind of looking and reaching out for people who were able to show love to their LGBTQ kids. And over the sequence of several months, I met a lot of these women, largely Mormon women, who were very vocal and very public about the love that they have for their LGBTQ child. And I'm like, wait a minute, this is amazing. And I started to hear these women and listen to their stories and listen to the angst and the trauma in their voice and in their stories. And at the time I was teaching as a lecturer at UVU, teaching a documentary photography class, and I would tell my students, now there will be something that comes right in front of you and parks itself that you have time for, you're the only one that has interest in, and you have the ability to photograph this story. This is up to you now as a documentary photographer. Are you going to do this thing, or are you going to let it go on by and no one ever really records it? So I'm giving my students this instruction, and I'm meeting the mama dragons at the same time. So what does Miss Kimberly do? Well, she either puts up or shuts up. So she decides to grab a camera and starts photographing 5 Mormon women and hearing their stories, and before long, and like I was originally shooting for 5. That was my goal, just to shoot. If I can find 5, it's like the hunt for Bigfoot. Like I thought that the Mormon mom loved their. Now this is an interesting parallel. It's just landing on me now. My hunt for the Mormon mom that loved their queer kid was as elusive as the hunt for Bigfoot. I am so smart. Look at me make these connections. I'll be a great therapist one day. So I found these women, and then before long, it turned into 20 moms I'd photographed, and then 50 moms, and then 100 moms, and now 137 moms. And I've lectured about this all over the West, lectured about it into Mexico City, into Bogota, Colombia, and this project turned me into a suicide education and prevention expert, and it turned me into a therapist. Same camera. This 8x10 camera now has a 5x7, reducing back on it. So I'm making photographs using a 5x7 piece of film, with a lens designed for portraiture, built in 1907. So it has a really interesting way of showing the world, and a really lovely way of rendering the portrait or the human face. So this is the last portrait, actually. This is my home in Riverton. And I don't know if, Darren, if you can see that Navajo blanket on the back wall. My dad actually traded that horse blanket for a horse from believe she was either Benali or a Begay down there. She was quite a weaver. I actually still own this blanket. It's one of my prized possessions, actually. So I visit them in their home, We have a conversation, I learn about their story, and then we set up the camera and we make the pictures. Dear friend of mine, Ronnie Jo, ACLU board member here in Salt Lake City, in her kitchen with the butcher block counter that I'm just to die for. This is, by the way, the carbon fiber tripod that we sacrificed to the Great Salt Lake. So there's Ronnie Jo. So the act of making these portraits, they're very stern, aren't they? They're affect, here's a psychological term, it's very flat. In some circles, you would call this their resting bitch face, or RBF for short. And this was an act of deliberately meditative practice. Sit them down, have them find their space, have them do some breathing, have them close their eyes, relax their face, open their eyes, and then look at the camera and then blink. And after they would blink, I would make the picture. I learned to wait for them to blink after many of them blinked while I was taking the picture. So I would deliberately say, you're going to blink at some point. Don't hold it back, because after you blink, that's when I'm going to make the picture. So we kind of developed this rhythm of making these portraits. And of course, this shutter is very difficult to maintain accurate shutter speeds. So I'm shooting indoors and outdoors, and sometimes negatives are very dense. And so the edge of this particular piece of film is very dense, and that's why you get this kind of fogging effect in the print. This is stern business. Being a Mormon mom or an Orthodox religious mom of a queer kid, of a trans kid. This is serious business. And I didn't want to portray an air of frivolity or lightness or all is well, all is well. There's a song about that, I think. I didn't want to portray that, but instead deliberately showed the resiliency and the steely grit that these women have that's necessary to be this advocate for their child in this environment that can sometimes be less than friendly. These women are my best friends. These women showed to me the possibility of a mom having unconditional love for their queer kid, loving their transgender kid, not knowing why, not knowing how, but still loving them. These women showed me an unconditional love that my mom could not. So that was one of the reasons that I really found myself drawn to them in the storytelling way, in the documentary way, in the compelling narrative kind of a thing, but also in a very cathartic, healing way for me. After photographing so many of these women, my marriage ended, I sold the house, dismantled the darkroom. It was a very tumultuous transitional period of my life, and became highly suicidal at times. And this project was very grounding for me. Brought me kind of back to center and told me that, there are ways that we can work through this. After so many interviews of 2 to 3 to 4 hours at a time, people started giving me the idea that maybe it would be helpful. And I kind of came to this idea on my own too. I'm giving these women lots of advice as a photography professor, as an artist, not as a therapist, not as a psychologist, not with any kind of training. They're asking for advice and for help. And I really didn't know what I was telling them was helpful. It really kind of was where I generated this idea of love and compassion needs to lead at the beginning of all this advocacy. After a while, I realized that I needed some training. I needed some formal training to be the most beneficial and the most helpful to these people that I was going to be working with, regardless of becoming a therapist or not. I would be in this space. I kind of became a sort of the risk of sounding arrogant, sort of a person that people would turn to. And so I knew if that was going to continue to be helpful, I needed to become serious about getting some training. And so that's when I looked at the University of San Francisco and enrolled in their counseling psychology department and graduated last May. So since last May and now, I'm working as an on-call therapist in residential eating disorder, drug and alcohol rehabilitation houses, working with adolescents and adults. It's been a remarkable remarkable journey for me. And I really haven't talked much about the transgender part of this, but I think that's where Deb and I will kind of jump in. I want to just open this, though, in a really free and genuine invitation. There will be a chance after we speak for you guys to ask questions. And I really invite you to kind of lean into the vulnerability, lean into the fear of asking the questions that you may be nervous about. I'm an educator now. I'm an activist now. I'm trained now. And I happen to be an expert on one thing, and that's my own life. And so I can share those things about that. So just an invitation. You can't screw up your questions. You can't offend me, because I've heard it all. And it's all run off my back. A little bit maybe is still sticking, but not bad. So when that happens, just again, an open invitation for a safe and healing space tonight. And I think this is my ending slide. Yeah. So we're going to go to Black. Do you want to say something again?
I'm just going to welcome Deb.
Oh, yeah, please welcome Deborah. I'll take my seat, and I'm going to take my pets with me.
I just want to welcome Deb Jenson to the stage. She's an assistant professor of public relations and social media here at Utah State University, and her research focuses on how marginalized groups influence our worlds. So help me welcome her and part 2 of our event tonight.
Well, hello.
Hey!
Fancy seeing you here.
I know. It's almost like we planned it.
Oh, did we plan it? I think somebody else planned it.
Oh, there we go. Thank you. All right, first of all, that was wonderful.
Thank you.
Your work is incredible.
I've had a lot of help, but thank you.
I already asked Kimberly so many questions before about how do you do that? It's amazing. I want to ask first, so your use of real film, the risk of blinking, salt paper processing, right? So all of this, it's expensive and it's time consuming and it requires you to capture the right moment from the right angle. How do you know when that is?
So one of the things I really learned early on as a therapist is that there's no right or wrong, right? Those of you who have a therapist that allow you to go to the right or the wrong and a therapist, there's a gray area that we live in. There's no right angle. Well, there is a right angle, but there's no correct angle for taking a photograph. There are helpful angles, there are not helpful angles. What do I want to tell? Where do I want to put the camera? What stays in the frame? What's eliminated from the frame? So I really have to take it back to, what do I want to say? Is this thing in the picture important to the story I want to tell? Well, in one of the photographs, there's a leftover styrofoam cooler that blew across the salt flats that's stuck on the end of the picture. I want that in the photograph. I want to see what marks we leave on the landscape. Other photographs, like with the rocket motor thing, what's behind me is amazingly beautiful, but I get to photograph that another day. Today's intent is to photograph the tail of that smoke rising up into the sky. So how do I know? It goes back to, what do I want to say? What's the intent? What's the story? And if I'm completely honest, sometimes I don't know until I get back to the darkroom and see the print. Mm-hmm.
Are you afraid when you go out and take photographs? That seems so scary. It seems so risky.
What about it seems risky?
She said she was going to interview me.
And initially, it was frightening because it's a lot of work to get the camera out of the car. The film is expensive. You have to order the film a year in advance from England. So you have to kind of know how much you want to use over the course of a year. So there is some fear, and then you have to put that aside and to make the pictures. And know that you will make pictures that aren't very successful. And know that you will make photographs that are exactly what you want. And also know that you're going to make photographs that transcend whatever it was that you set out initially to photograph. So yes, there's fear, and you have to work through it, and sometimes they coexist at the same time. The work and the fear can exist at the same time. And you do it anyway.
I mean, because you can see the love. in what you're, like the love of the landscape. You can see that in your love and respect for the women that you're photographing. That is so clear. So fear doesn't come through, but you can definitely see that there's emotion.
So photographing the mama dragons, there was no fear. Like, it was the labor of love. It was an honor to be invited into their circle. Honestly, kind of a sacred circle of pain, and to have those stories shared with me. And so, more than fear with the Mama Dragon Project, and maybe this is actually an epiphany to other areas, it was an honor to photograph them. And if I look at the work from Great Salt Lake, it's also an honor to do that work as well, because not a lot of people get to do that. Not a lot of people get to know Great Salt Lake. I mean, it's a weird thing that we have here in our backyard that not a lot of people really appreciate. But when you take the time to listen and hear its story and be patient, and I was sharing this with Jamie this morning, Jamie Butler, when you show the lake respect, when you go out there with fresh water, when you go out there with a day's worth of food that's extra, when you go out there with the right clothing and enough gas to get you out and back, when you treat the lake with respect, it starts to reveal its stories and its secrets to you in a very similar way to the Mama Dragons, quite frankly, yeah. So no fear, just a respect and an honor to be able to be in the right place and tell those stories.
That's interesting. That reminds me, Darren's blessing, I'm going to butcher this, I'm very sorry, said something about a desire that you find a blessing in every tree and rock, which I thought was very appropriate for what we were going to look at. So I'm wondering how, I wonder.
That's you want my do for amen.
Oh, gotcha. I was very confused there for a second. I'm wondering, how does this relate to your focus on the landscape? Like, what is it that drew you to it? Even in the Bigfoot pictures, you take a lot of pictures of places.
I think I just forgot what the question was. Ask the question again. I'm still trying to figure out what the nugget of that question is.
Yeah. So I'm curious. His prayer had a blessing, a desire that we find a blessing in every tree and rock, something like that. Wanting to find something in nature. What can I give back?
For the reminder, because I was kind of stuck on the Aho thing. And back to Darren's blessing, as he spoke that blessing, I greet Creator with a face up. I want that energy from Creator to land on me in a very similar way that I want the energy from the lake and the rock and the water to also land on me. I also heard him speak of personal medicine. Healing medicine. And for me, that's what the lake is. So when I'm out on the lake, touching the salt, breathing the salt, hearing the wind, feel it cross my body, that is medicine to me. So the lake, going to the lake is a form of communion with the Creator, with the divine. It also was very interesting to realize that the lake was the only thing that didn't judge me. It let me go be there, and it wouldn't judge me. It demanded respect. It had an expectation that I play by its rules, but it didn't judge me. If I didn't play by the lake's rules, I would pay a penalty. One of those penalties was spending 3 days stuck in the mud out on the West Desert and being rescued by Utah Highway Patrol helicopter. That was one of the penalties. And many of the successes you've seen tonight. So you have to play by the lake's rules. You have to respect the lake. And then it will reveal to you its medicine, its healing power, and its stories. And I heard that over and over in Darren's blessing.
Wow. So you speak about the lake as healing for you and something that you need, right? And we talked about this before. I find it really interesting that you're a therapist now and also an artist. Is photography your way to kind of therapize yourself? That's a word I just made.
So we have a joke amongst therapists when we get together for lunch. We kind of have this thing we say, don't therapize me. Don't you therapize me. Okay, I'll back up. So as with an attorney, your worst client is yourself. You can't be your own therapist because you're too close to the problems. And my photography has been my inner work. It has been my shadow work. It has been my trauma work. Going out and photographing has been my mindful awareness. It has been my opposite action. These are DBT skills that we teach our clients. It has been very deliberate active therapy, absolutely. Where am I in the moment? Where am I going to put that foot of the tripod? There or there? Because here it's got sure footing, and here it's going to fall over and get shattered into a million pieces. And that difference can be the difference of half an inch. So a keen mindful awareness of where every single thing goes and what every component of all the processes are. It's a very deliberate act of mindful awareness, which is a form of Zen Buddhism, meditation. Some would call it prayer, communion with your inner self, which in the Buddhism, namaste, this whole idea of the divine is within me, the divine is within you. So this mindful awareness of who we are is also a form of communion with this larger idea of creator. So is it my therapy? Yes, and I have 5 other therapists that aren't photographers. That's true, by the way. I do have 5 other therapists.
Everyone should have at least one.
Mm-hmm. And therapists need 5.
Well, you have to listen.
And that's true, by the way.
You have to listen to the rest of us. I've always wondered how you dealt with it. Well, let me. I don't want to ask if you have a favorite photo, but that suggests to me that you have photographs that you look at and you know what you were going through at that moment, or it takes you. Do they take you back? Are there photographs you won't look at? You said you have a favorite one.
So that's like 5 questions. So let's pin those. Let's pin those. My favorite photograph is the one I'm going to take next.
Oh, stop it. That's too deep for me.
It's true. My favorite photograph is the one I'm going to take next. Otherwise, why even bother? Am I done? Oh, if my favorite photograph was back then, it's time to pack up the cameras and start cooking. My favorite photograph is the next photograph. Pictures that I won't look at? No, I have to look at them all. Even the ones that are painful. To know what to keep and to know what not to keep. I always told my students the best tool in the darkroom is the trash can. We have to know when to kill our darlings. And I don't know which ones to throw away if I don't look at them. Do they bring back memories? For me, in my own practice and when I teach, I consider a photograph a memory trigger. This takes us back to a place. And my photography now, my personal work, is photographing memories because it is work regarding my trauma from my adoption and separation from my birth mother. So this happened when I was an infant to 5 weeks old. I have no memories of that. So when I'm photographing these things, I'm actually kind of creating what I think could be a memory based on location and narrative that I know from that time in my life. And my understanding of early childhood development as well. So the psychology of the therapy world kind of comes back into playing with and interplaying with fine art. Yeah.
Oh, that sounds so cool. Which brings me to, because I know we have people who want to ask questions, and I don't want to take up everyone else's time. So you did the lake, Bigfoot, mama dragons. I'm wondering if you can, this is a question at the university, right? You have to answer it for tenure. What is your trajectory? Draw a line through your work. What is it that's they kind of all have in common?
Storytelling.
And what's the next thing?
Storytelling.
No, that's not, no, you have to give a more specific answer than that, right? Like, what kind of stories, though, are you trying to tell?
Kenny Rogers tells some good stories.
So does Neil Diamond.
Pink Floyd tells some great stories. Yeah, that's right. AC/DC tells some great stories.
Oh, God, yes,
right?
absolutely.
So I'm a storyteller. That's my background is in journalism, photojournalism. I started in the communications department right over the thing here, telling stories. Even as my commercial work was all about telling stories. The thing that's interesting now as a therapist is I don't get to tell these stories. I get to hold these stories. So I have these two kind of these parallel arcs of telling stories and holding stories. And I need to be able to draw a very firm boundary, which ones I tell and which ones I hold. Kenny Rogers. Is there a song about that?
I don't know.
Know when to hold them.
Yeah, the cards. Yeah,
know when to fold
gotcha.
them.
Gotcha.
Sorry,
yeah.
I'm butchering Kenny Rogers. What's the trajectory? What's the arc? Well,
can I ask you while you think about that?
Yeah.
Can I ask you a question? Because it seems like as I'm looking at your photos, and you're telling us about them, right, and what you're looking for, even in your Bigfoot series, right? Like you're looking for truth, right? Like you're trying to get the lake to tell its story, but like what it actually is. There are tons of stories about the lake, but like tell me what it actually is. Sometimes it's ugly and has a styrofoam cooler on it. And sometimes it's beautiful and has all of these waves whirling around. And the same thing with the Bigfoot. Like you're taking pictures of where they happened, but this is what people experience. You're not answering the question of whether Bigfoot's there or not, right? So I'm wondering does that work for you, or do you allow anyone to say, whatever story it told you is the story?
So that's kind of what I demand of the viewer. Oh, let me turn this off on accident. There we go. I demand that of the viewer. I want them to think about it. I often, when I'm teaching, again, I go back to this idea of what makes a good photograph. And at the end of that very simple formula, the end is a question mark. If the photograph doesn't invite the viewer to ask a question, it fails. Because we all know how the movie Titanic ends. We know it sinks, spoiler alert.
That destroyed my 14-year-old daughter when she watched it 2 years ago.
Are you kidding me? No, but I want the photograph to ask a question. Otherwise, why keep looking like the next photograph thing? I want to invite a conversation. I don't want to end a conversation. So if I am doing anything with my photographs, it is not providing an answer deliberately because I want the viewer to think. I talked about this in the photography class I lectured at this afternoon, shared some work. I want my photographs to start from a place of emotion because I want the viewer to have an emotional response. I don't care if it's positive. I don't care if it's negative. I just really care that it's not neutral and that they don't come away from my show saying, I really liked your frames. Where did you get your frames? Oh, I made them in the garage. But, I mean, that is true. But that's what I don't want people to care about the frames. I want them to care about the emotion that the photograph provides, either positive or negative. And honestly, I really don't care. Just give me something. I hated that work. Thank you. You felt something. No, seriously, it sounds kind of weird, but I do. If they have a strong visceral reaction, good. Tell me why you hate them. Explain to me why you hate them. What did you bring to the viewing experience that led you to have a negative reaction to these photographs? I love them. Great. How was that? What was that viewing experience like for you? No, I don't. I mean, I give an artist statement and I talk about process and a little bit about intent, but I really never want the viewer to come away knowing exactly what the photograph is about. I want them to learn more.
Interesting.
It's very Socratic.
It is. So now what's next? Yeah, like what is the next thing? Your life has been one transition after another, right? We said that word, boom.
Transition counter.
I think that's, I think for, at least for me, when I look at it, at your work and you tell your story, I think like, oh wow, like this helps me with the transitions I might be going through, or it helps me better understand one that right? Like, again, that picture of the waves, the water with the like I'm still thinking about it in my head.
Me too.
I'm barely even in this conversation right now. I'm still thinking about that photograph.
You know what? That's part of that photograph to stick with you.
Yeah.
I hope it sticks with you 5 years from now.
Yeah, and it made me think of like, wow, like when I go, the transition I'm experiencing right now is it's tumultuous and I don't know what's next and it feels dangerous.
Good.
And you've
there.
done that so many times. I wonder like, yeah, what is the next project? Not next transition, maybe in like life or work or whatever, but like, what's your next project? What do you want to do next?
I want to go to work on Monday and start working with kids again in Sacramento. That is the next project. I have a 3-week assignment at a new residence. Photographically, what's the next project?
Yeah.
Probably just continuing work on this adoption series.
That is so cool. I can't wait. I'm excited.
Well, and I talked about this a little bit today in class. I have documents about my adoption process from my adoptive parents. I don't know much about my birth mom, just a few things, but I have a lot of documentation, dates and sites that I can go and visit. And it is interesting, I live currently in Sacramento, and I was born in Sacramento. So I have the ability to go to the exact site on the exact day and make a photograph that could possibly have been what little baby Kimberly might have been experiencing in that moment. So the morning of my 50th birthday, and this is a really personal story, I don't really share that much. The morning of my 50th birthday was the day that I was at my internship site at this K-7 elementary school. I wanted to connect with my birth mother. So I got out of bed very early, and I drove to the hospital where I was born at. And I got this old camera from 1953, this Linhof 4x5, and explained what I was doing and what I wanted to do to the charge nurse. I said, I'm doing a project on trauma, individual trauma, and birth and things and adoption. And she's like, oh, okay, cool. And I said, what's this for? And I said, well, I'm actually an MFT student at USF, University of San Francisco. She's like, oh, okay, cool. So, and she knew that I understood HIPAA and privacy and that I would not want to photograph, names or faces, any identifiable information. And she granted me permission to photograph in the maternity ward for about 45 minutes. Just the hallway, the machinery, the comings and goings. And I'm holding this camera, a 4x5 camera, which you normally use on a tripod, and I'm slowing the shutter speed down to about 1 second. And I'm introducing shake into the camera. Because the memories of the morning of my birth certainly would have been shaky and grainy and not focused and unclear and confusing. And so I'm really trying to, with the camera, introduce some emotion and some technique that brings something of a memory or a dream of a memory or maybe even a hope of a memory to that particular thing. So I'm making photographs largely for me. There was a moment of hopeful anticipation of maybe meeting my birth mother in that space, in that moment of time. That did not happen. And that was okay. And I spent a few minutes in the lobby, packing the gear into the case, and just kind of being there and watching people come and go. And is that her? No. Is that her? No, it's not her. And then kind of going, Kimberly, it's time to go. School starts in 20 minutes, and you got a 25-minute drive across the city. And so I'd pack it up and go to work and jump in with the kids that day. But in that early hour and a half, really giving myself some space to think and feel and be this 0-day-old, brand new newborn baby version of me. And this project will probably have 30 to 40 images in it. Handmade images, cyanotypes on large paper with questions and notes, and maybe some poetry or a haiku or a doodle or something. It'll be bound, it'll be hand bound, and it will be something that I never show to anybody. I'll never show it to anybody. This is my work for me. And because I know I will never show it to anybody, I grant myself permission to be really vulnerable, to really dive into my potentially past experience. What was that like for me? And with that kind of that barrier in place of, you're never going to see this. So because you're never going to see this, I can do whatever I want. And really getting into this mode of, this could have happened here, or what would it have been like if that happened here? And really just trying to photograph memories, or maybe even photographing an echo of a memory. That's really what this project is about.
Wow, thank you. Thank you for sharing that with us. If anyone has questions, we have a microphone right over here. And Kimberly has said this is...
Because we really haven't talked much about gender stuff.
Yeah, sorry, I kept it very...
It is the elephant in the room that's in my bag in the hallway. So we can kind of, if we want to dive there, who came... Anyway.
I kept it really artsy because I'm not artsy. I don't understand art.
Says the girl with the blue hair.
That's the art in me. That's it.
So, take it away. However you want to do this, go for it.
Well, we do have a question back here.
I do. I'm curious, in your time with the mothers, did you come away with either a personal or just theoretical ideas of what makes them different from the other mothers who aren't in their place?
well, we have several live specimens of mama dragons in the room. And at the risk of speaking for them, I would say that the identifiable difference is the ability to love boldly in the face of public pressure not to, or not to love visibly and vocally. I would say that that's the difference, a lack of fear about love. And I'm going to look and see, do I see any nodding heads? Is that good enough? Close enough?
I saw a couple over there.
Thank you. And I don't want to speak for them because that's not my experience, but that's how I've experienced you guys. You have an ability to love beyond fear of being judged, which is very powerful. And having met many of the kids of these moms, it does not go unnoticed. And let's just dip into therapy for a moment. When you have unconditional love for your child at school, at home, in the workplace, and in your social network, in those 4 places, you reduce symptoms of depression, symptoms of anxiety, symptoms of suicidality from 91% to 60% to 30% down to 3%, which is the statistical norm for the rest of society. Love. It's the easiest, cheapest, quickest, most beneficial, scientifically proven intervention that a person can have for their child. It's just to love them unconditionally. It's really that simple. Yeah.
I'm curious while he's running, as someone who's been in the Mormon community and has kind of experienced loss because of my orientation. We know what the difference is. So now how do we get other people? You're a therapist. How do we get other people to develop that love?
So there's a saying about horses and water, which is very true about love. I can tell you all this data. I can show you examples. I can write a book. I can photograph till I'm blue in the face or the hair, and it won't matter until you decide you want to do this. All I can do is show modeling, show examples, be a soft place to ask questions, and really not judge you if you come to me looking for help. That's all I can do, is just show you unconditional love in your journey that might be rough and rocky. That's all I can do.
My husband is always saying, "Oh no, she's asking a question." I can't help it. Can I just say I'm truly touched by your story. It's amazing. And I really identify, not because you're transgender, but just because I identify with your photographs. And I know that when she asked you the question, what's your favorite photograph? And you said, I want you to see what you see in that photograph. But can I just say that this is how I identify and see, and tell me if I'm off.
No, you're not off.
When you photographed the lake, I see a great vast emptiness that sometimes you could just walk into and be done. And you spoke about suicidal tendencies, and sometimes I recall living at a beachside and thinking I could just walk into that water, because we all have our struggles, right? And then when you photographed the Bigfoot, I saw that you were just really just wanting the truth. You just want to know the truth, whether it was one person's story or another person's story, but for yourself. And in your Mama Dragon, I feel like you just want a mom that is like that. And so for me, I see all of your photography as validation. Every single thing validated your feelings. And even though they're there for people to find what they see, I think it's wonderful how you have taking the next step in your life, however you did it, whatever you had to do, because we all have to do that. But I know that my entire life was centered around validation. And so that is very special that we all, stream it a certain way. But I find your story very amazing. Thank you for sharing it.
Thank you for the vulnerability regarding your own emotions in the past and for the vulnerability regarding suicidal ideation. Just so we're aware, about 80% of on any given day, 80% of the populace thinks about suicide. It's the thing that we think about. It's not a thing that we act on normally, usually, but it's a thing that many people think about. I want to normalize thoughts of suicide. That's passive suicidality. Passive suicidality is very common. When it turns into active suicidality is where I get a little more concerned and start working with the client a little more closely. I hear emotion in your voice regarding what you saw on the screen. So that's what I want. Thank you for seeing something that draws emotion out from the work. Thank you for seeing your own journey in my work. Because one of the things I like it to be is somewhat universal. I invite you to step into that world. What is that like in that world? Is it smelly? Is it hot? Is it cold? Is it scary? Or is it refreshing and new? So thank you for going on that journey with me and having a strong emotional reaction. That honors me more than anything else. Thank you.
We have a question here. There's a boldness in your whole life and your work. It's really impressive.
So, truth be told, this is what you experience in the moment now. It has not always been the case.
Hello, as a fellow therapist, I am really just excited that you're here. Yes, Queer Therapists Unite. And I'm curious, because I feel like my whole life I knew that I wanted to be a therapist and I knew that I wanted to heal. And I'm curious about your transition from kind of artist, photographer, and those healing mechanisms to being with clients in residential treatment. What's been difficult about that? What's been rewarding? What are the parallels? Just maybe speaking to kind of that journey of kind of how you interact with storytelling.
Thank you for being a queer therapist, because we need representation, and it has been my goal to be the therapist that I needed when I was 12 or when I was 10. And I share that with my clients that are queer or trans. I don't want to be you, and I don't want to be your parent, but I want to be the therapist that you need today in the same way that I needed a therapist when I was your age. So this journey as becoming a therapist is all about reacting in the moment, living in the moment. As a photographer, what can I do other than, especially working out in the landscape? Could rain, sun moves, things shift under my feet. It's a very improvisational act, being a location or a nature photographer. Very close to being an improvisational jazz musician. I'm always listening and reacting to the players that are around me. As a photographer, I'm always listening and reacting to the players around me, the weather, nature, my gear, myself. I have to listen and respond in exactly the same way that I must be prepared to pivot and change and reflect with the client. I can never make that session about me. I always have to make that session about the client. When I go into a session with a client, it is really just removing myself from the equation and responding to their story. They're coming to me with a narrative or a slice of a narrative, which, by the way, is my theoretical framework, right? I want to help them understand their narrative. I want to help them create a picture of their trauma timeline in a way that's therapeutically beneficial and healing, and not therapy or not trauma inducing, but trauma healing. And I'm at the very beginning of this journey, so I have a lot of training left to do, thankfully, because if I knew everything I needed to know now, I am woefully underprepared for every day I go to work. So the response to the world as a location photographer is nearly identical to that of being in the moment in the room with the therapy client, of having to respond with no emotion, having to respond and not making it about me reacting to them, but about me modifying where I'm going to go next depending on what they show to me. In the same way that the photography does. It's nearly an identical process. It's very fascinating, having been well trained as a photographer and becoming better trained as a therapist, how parallel those processes are. The one thing that's interesting about being a photographer is it's all about me telling the world who I am and what I've done. Being a therapist, you'll never know my work. You'll never see the titles of the people I work with or the pieces of art. You'll never know my process. And you'll never see the finished piece. So it's a very anonymous form of artistic practice, whereas creating prints and photograph is a very visible way of being an artist. Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you for asking the question.
One last question from anyone?
It is 6:30. Are you guys really out of questions?
They're hungry. It's 6:30.
Thank you, Kimberly, and thank you, Deborah. And thank you, Darren, for being here. We have some refreshments over at the museum, and so you can come over and speak to Kimberly, and if you have more questions to ask her. We also recorded this and we live streamed it, and so if you know anyone who missed this event, they can please point them to our website or to us, and we can share that with them as well. A museum and art is, someone said recently that, actually it was the director at Utah Museum of Contemporary Art, people come here and they say to me, students, K through 12 is what we were talking about, that this is the only place, there's no right or wrong here, I'm not judged here. And art has that ability to do that. And so I encourage you all to take time with the artwork that's on view and to take the opportunity, if you would like, to ask Kimberly some more questions next door while we enjoy some refreshments. So thank you so much for coming.